Something is happening again in 2026, and most people are not paying attention yet. But you are here, which means something already pulled you in. Listen closely, because what I am about to reveal is not new. It has been written, spoken, and buried for decades. And yet, it is resurfacing now, at the exact moment people thought was impossible. Why? Because time has a strange way of circling back, and some predictions never really disappear. They wait until the world is ready to notice them again. You might think this is just another story, another internet rumor, another theory. But what if I told you that fragments of the past are starting to match the present, and not in a small way, in a way that makes people stop, rewind, and rethink everything they believed about time itself? There are old records, forgotten notes, private readings, messages that were never meant to become public conversations. And now, in 2026, people are connecting dots that were never supposed to meet. A shift in nature patterns, unusual changes in Earth's rhythm, unexpected movements in human behavior across continents. Coincidence or alignment? That is the question echoing across researchers, spiritual seekers, and skeptics alike. But here is what makes this even more intense. The original predictions were never about fear alone. They were about transition, a turning point, not just in the world, but in human awareness itself. And that is why this topic is exploding again right now. Because something feels different this time. People are reporting strange déjà vu moments, dreams that feel like memories, and a growing sense that time is speeding up. Science calls it perception bias. Spiritual circles call it awakening. But neither side fully explains the feeling people are describing. So what is really happening? In this video, you are going to uncover the hidden layers behind these claims. Not just the surface story, but the deeper structure behind it. We will break it down step by step. What was originally recorded in those early predictions? What parts were symbolic? And what parts people believe are now becoming visible in real life? You will also see something most videos never show you: the lesser-known details, the overlooked fragments, the parts that were quietly removed from mainstream discussions because they were considered too uncertain. But sometimes, uncertainty is exactly where truth hides. You will learn why 2026 is being discussed so heavily in spiritual and alternative research communities, why certain dates keep repeating across different interpretations, and why so many independent voices are suddenly aligning on the same idea. A transition point is near. But transition does not always mean destruction. Sometimes it means unveiling, and that is the part most people miss. Because history doesn't always change with explosions. Sometimes it changes with awareness. A shift in understanding, a shift in perception, a shift in what humans believe is possible. And once that shift begins, nothing remains the same again. So I want you to stay with me until the end of this video, because the final part will connect everything: the timelines, the predictions, the modern events, and the patterns that seem unrelated until you see them from the right angle. And when that happens, you may start to look at 2026 not as a random year, but as a marker, a checkpoint in something much larger than we were ever taught. Now, before we go deeper, understand this. This is not about fear, and it is not about blind belief either. It is about observation, connection, and awareness. Because once you start seeing patterns, you cannot unsee them. And that is exactly why this topic keeps resurfacing. It refuses to stay buried. It keeps finding its way back into conversations, back into questions, back into curiosity, almost as if it wants to be understood, not ignored. And now, you are part of that conversation too. In the next moments, we will go deeper into the origins of these predictions, how they were first interpreted, and why modern events are forcing people to revisit them with new eyes. You may agree, you may disagree, but by the end, you will understand why so many are paying attention again. Because something is building beneath the surface, quiet, invisible, but persistent. And when it finally becomes visible, it may feel like it was always there, waiting. So stay with me, don't skip ahead, because what comes next could change the way you think about time itself. And if you're new here, welcome. You have just entered a space where we explore hidden knowledge, forgotten insights, and the mysteries of human existence. This channel is called Reincarnation Secrets, and if this is the kind of journey you want to continue, make sure you subscribe, because what we are about to uncover next goes far deeper than most people are ready for. Have you ever wondered how some names refuse to fade away, even after decades? How certain voices from the past keep coming back into modern conversations, like they were never truly gone? Because that is exactly what is happening here. A man who lived long before the digital age, before satellites, before modern forecasting systems. Yet his name is still being spoken in 2026 discussions. Not because of fame, not because of media promotion, but because of something far more unusual. Ideas that people are still trying to understand. He was not a typical writer, not a public speaker in the way we think of today. He would enter a self-induced trance state, and in that altered state of consciousness, he would speak. Not random words, but structured ideas, observations, and warnings that were carefully written down by people around him. He never sat down to publish books in the traditional sense. He never built a system of promotion. He never controlled how his messages were interpreted later. Everything we know today comes from recordings, notes, and archived transcripts preserved by his followers. And that alone makes the entire story more complex. Because when you separate the message from the messenger, interpretation begins to change. Some of the most repeated themes in those recorded sessions were not about everyday life. They were about patterns, cycles, and long-term shifts. He often spoke in terms that sounded symbolic, but carried a strange consistency across different readings. Earth changes, not just weather, but large-scale transformations in natural systems, movements of land, shifts in environmental balance, unusual geological activity. And while many of these statements were written in metaphorical language, people today still debate whether they were symbolic warnings or literal forecasts. Then there were references to global conflict cycles, not tied to one specific nation or event, but described as repeating human tendencies across generations. Periods of tension, followed by rebuilding, followed by renewed tension again, as if history itself moves in waves. And according to some interpretations of those archived readings, humanity would pass through phases where those cycles feel more intense, more concentrated, more noticeable. Another recurring idea was the shift in human behavior itself. Not just politics or systems, but internal change. A change in how people think, how they perceive reality, how they respond to uncertainty. Some described it as emotional acceleration. Others interpreted it as a spiritual awakening. And some dismissed it entirely as abstract language with no measurable meaning. But what makes these records so widely discussed even today is not certainty. It is ambiguity. Because ambiguity leaves space for interpretation, and interpretation keeps ideas alive far longer than facts sometimes do. There were also references to what could be called transformation periods in modern times, phases where humanity would experience shifts that feel sudden, even though they may have been building slowly underneath the surface for years. And here is where things become interesting in 2026 conversations. People are not just revisiting these writings for curiosity. They are comparing them with present-day events. Environmental changes are being reported more frequently, unusual patterns in weather behavior across multiple regions, increased discussions around global instability, and a growing psychological sense of acceleration in daily life. None of these are new individually, but together, they are being placed under the same lens. A lens that asks whether these patterns were anticipated, or whether humans are simply more aware of them now. His followers never claimed uniform certainty about interpretation. Even during his lifetime, there were disagreements about what his statements actually meant. Some believed the messages were literal predictions about future Earth changes. Others believed they were symbolic reflections of human consciousness cycles, and others suggested they were influenced by the cultural language of the time. And that debate never truly ended. Instead, it evolved. Every generation reinterprets those records differently. What was once read as distant prophecy became psychological metaphor. What was once dismissed as coincidence became pattern recognition. And what was once forgotten in archives is now resurfacing in online discussions and research communities. And despite all disagreement, one fact remains unchanged. The name still appears in modern conversations. Not occasionally, but repeatedly, across decades, across platforms, across different types of thinkers, researchers, spiritual communities, skeptics, historians, all revisiting the same archived material from different angles. And now, in the context of 2026 discussions, his recorded ideas are being placed back into circulation again. Not as fixed truth, not as a rejected myth, but as something in between. Something people are trying to re-examine with modern eyes. Because when old predictions start to echo inside new timelines, people naturally begin asking whether they were ever truly separated in the first place. Have you ever noticed how a single phrase can start spreading across the world long before anyone agrees on what it actually means? How people hear the same words but imagine completely different realities inside them. Turning Point 2026. Say it slowly. It sounds simple at first, almost harmless, like just another date, another prediction, another idea floating in endless conversations. But when people repeat it enough times, something begins to change. It stops sounding like a date and starts sounding like a threshold, a line between what was and what comes next. And I have spoken before about such moments, not as fixed events carved into stone, but as patterns, phases, movements within the human experience that tend to repeat in different forms. A turning point is rarely understood while it is happening, because those inside the movement rarely feel the shift at the exact moment it begins. They only recognize it later, when the world they remember no longer matches the world they are standing in. That is how transition works. Quiet at first, almost invisible, then suddenly undeniable. When people speak of 2026 as a turning point, they are not always describing destruction. That is the mistake many make when they hear such language. They assume collapse. But transformation is not always a collapse. Sometimes it is restructuring. Sometimes it is acceleration. Sometimes it is simply the beginning of systems becoming something else entirely. Let me take you deeper into what people interpret when they use this phrase, because interpretations matter. They shape how fear or curiosity spreads through collective thought. One interpretation speaks of global systems shifting, not in a single moment, not in one dramatic collapse, but in gradual realignment. Systems of communication, systems of governance, systems of connection between people, all evolving faster than the structures that once held them steady. And when systems evolve faster than their foundations, tension appears, not always visible, but always present beneath the surface. Another interpretation speaks of technological dominance reaching a new threshold, where tools that once supported human decision-making begin to influence it more directly, where automation does not just assist, but begins to guide, where information moves faster than the ability to fully process it. And in such a world, perception itself becomes unstable. Because when everything is immediate, understanding becomes delayed. and delay creates confusion. Confusion creates reinterpretation, and reinterpretation reshapes reality in ways people do not always notice at first. There is also a discussion of economic restructuring, not in isolated regions, but in interconnected global patterns, where traditional systems of value begin to adjust under new pressures, not necessarily collapsing, but reorganizing, like rivers finding new paths when the ground beneath them shifts slightly. No single moment defines it, yet over time, the landscape looks entirely different. And people who lived through both stages often say the same thing: it changed while we weren't watching. But perhaps the most subtle interpretation involves human behavior itself. Because systems do not change alone, people change with them. Or perhaps in response to them. There are moments in history where collective behavior seems to accelerate, where emotions become more amplified, where attention becomes more fragmented, where reactions become faster than reflection. Some describe this as adaptation. Others describe it as overstimulation. But regardless of the label, the experience feels the same to those inside it. Everything feels faster: thoughts, decisions, reactions, conversations. Even time itself feels like it is moving differently. And when people experience that collectively, they begin to search for meaning in the acceleration. They begin to ask whether something external is changing, or whether perception itself is shifting. In this framework, 2026 is not seen as an endpoint. It is seen as a transition point, a moment where multiple lines of change begin to intersect more visibly than before. But even that interpretation must be handled carefully, because human minds naturally seek patterns, even where only fragments exist. And fragments can create powerful illusions of structure. Let me be clear in the way I have always been clear. Interpretation is not certainty. What people connect to this idea of a turning point is shaped as much by observation as it is by expectation. And expectation is a powerful force. When people expect change, they begin to notice change more easily, not because it suddenly appears, but because awareness sharpens toward it. That is how perception works. And perception can make a slow shift feel sudden, or make a gradual evolution feel like an event. This is why discussions around 2026 vary so widely. Some describe it as a breakthrough moment. Others describe it as a destabilization phase. Others still describe it as a consciousness shift. Each interpretation reflects not just what is being observed, but who is observing it, and what framework they bring into their observation. In earlier times, when I spoke or was recorded speaking through trance states, the language used often reflected cycles, not fixed predictions, but repeating patterns of human experience. Because cycles are easier to observe than exact events. A cycle does not tell you what will happen on a specific day, it suggests rhythm. Rise, tension, release, reset. Over and over again in different forms across generations. And when people look at modern events through that lens, they begin to see familiar shapes, even if the details are new. The structure feels familiar, and familiarity creates the illusion of repetition. That is why some people believe we are entering a repeating phase again, while others argue we are simply in a unique moment with no historical echo at all. Both perspectives exist simultaneously, and neither can fully eliminate the other. Because reality is rarely experienced from only one angle at a time. There is also something deeper people rarely discuss openly when they mention turning points. It is not only about external systems. It is about internal readiness. Because a turning point is only meaningful if something within humanity is prepared to recognize it. Otherwise, it passes unnoticed, like countless other transitions in history that were only understood after they had already occurred. And this raises a question that does not belong to any single belief system. It belongs to observation itself. If change is always happening gradually, then at what moment does gradual change become recognized as transformation? Is it when events accelerate, or when awareness finally catches up? This distinction matters more than people realize, because it determines whether 2026 is seen as an origin or a recognition point. Some believe new forces are emerging, reshaping global direction in real time. Others believe humans are simply becoming more aware of processes that were already in motion long before attention was drawn to them. And between these two interpretations lies a space that is difficult to define, a space where uncertainty lives, not as ignorance, but as incompleteness. Because not all patterns reveal themselves fully at once. Some unfold slowly enough that only hindsight makes them visible as a whole. And in that sense, discussing a turning point is not about predicting a singular outcome. It is about recognizing that multiple processes may be converging without assuming finality, without assuming a conclusion. Just observation and continued awareness of how many threads may be weaving together beneath the surface of daily life. Some will continue to map every event to this idea of 2026, and some will reject the entire framework as coincidence-based storytelling. But in between those positions, there is a quieter space, a space of watching, not rushing toward conclusions, not dismissing possibilities too quickly, simply observing how patterns evolve. Because sometimes, the most important understanding does not come from deciding what something is, but from noticing how long it takes for meaning to reveal itself, and whether it changes shape as it moves through different perspectives. That is where true analysis begins. Not at certainty, but at recognition that certainty itself may arrive too early to fully capture what is still unfolding. So what should we actually believe after hearing all of this? There is no verified scientific evidence that 2026 is a fixed turning point in history. And there is no clear, direct prediction that definitively marks this specific year as a global threshold. What exists instead are interpretations, fragments, and repeated discussions that grow stronger during times of uncertainty. And that is an important distinction to understand. Because ideas like this do not survive for decades simply because they are proven. They survive because they resonate with something inside human curiosity, a desire to find patterns in chaos, to find meaning in change, to find structure in uncertainty. But meaning is not the same as certainty, and interpretation is not the same as evidence. That is why the responsible approach is not fear and not blind belief either. It is awareness. Awareness of how quickly information spreads, awareness of how narratives form, and awareness of how easily timing and coincidence can feel connected when viewed through emotion instead of analysis. Instead of asking, "Is this prediction true?" a more grounded question might be, what is actually changing in the world right now that makes people feel like something big is approaching? Because whether predictions are accurate or not, real-world changes are always happening. Technology is evolving, societies are shifting, environments are responding, and human behavior is adapting with increasing speed. These are observable facts, not interpretations. And how we respond to those changes matters more than labeling a specific year as a fixed point of destiny. Because the future is not locked into a single prediction. It is shaped continuously by present actions, decisions, and awareness. And that means the most important control we have is not in predicting outcomes, but in understanding the present clearly enough to respond wisely to it. So instead of focusing on fear or certainty, focus on awareness. Stay informed, observe, think critically, and question information before accepting it as fact. Because once you remove emotion from interpretation, clarity becomes easier to see. And clarity is what allows better decisions in uncertain times. Now, before you go, If you found this exploration interesting, take a second to like this video. It really helps the channel grow and reach more people who are searching for a deeper understanding of these topics. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel, Reincarnation Secrets, because we will continue exploring hidden histories, forgotten perspectives, and the mysteries that still shape how people see the world today. Stay curious, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next one.